This is Theory of Change. I'm Matthew Sheffield. Thanks for joining me. For many years, many non Americans assumed that the right wing extremism that powers the political career of Donald Trump was just an American phenomenon. But I think we can all agree by now that this is simply not true. Far right parties have been elected in nations like Italy, Poland, and Hungary, and Benjamin Netanyahu's Israeli government is a coalition of openly racist and genocidal parties. And for the first time in modern history, far right political parties are placing first in public opinion surveys in the UK, France, and Germany. These trends aren't in place in every country, of course, but they do suggest there is something deeply wrong with left liberalism as practiced in many nations. That's especially true in the UK, where Labour Prime Minister Keir Starmer is systematically ceding policy ground to reactionaries like Nigel Farage on issues like immigration and trans rights, in a way that would make even Chuck Schumer blush. The leaders of both the Democrats in the US and Labour in the UK seem to be operating under the impression that making concessions to the right wing will somehow mollify them. But the voting data keeps showing that this does not work. How has liberalism become so moribund? Is it a simple misunderstanding about how politics works on the part of the leaders? Is it because they're simply cowards? Or is there something deeply pathological about liberalism itself and its philosophical approach to governance versus politicking? I'd argue that it's all three of these things. And joining me in this episode to discuss is Toby Buckle. He's host of the Political Philosophy podcast and a columnist who has recently written about the lingering negative impact of the philosopher John Rawls. We also discuss the concept of reactionary centrism, a term that some American progressives have been using to describe people who self-describe as liberal, but seem to almost never criticize the radical right. I don't think that's an accurate term, but I do agree with Toby that it describes something very real. I hope you'll enjoy it. Theory of Change is part of the Flux Media Network, so go to flux.community for more podcasts and articles about politics, technology, media, and society, and how they all intersect. And if you like what we're doing, we have free and paid subscription options available on both Patreon and Substack. Just go to patreon.com/discoverflux, or you can go to flux.community to subscribe on Substack. My thanks to everybody who is a paid subscriber. Thank you very much for your support. And if you can't afford to do a paid subscription option now, I understand that, but you can support the show by posting links to it on your social media and recommending that I be a guest on your favorite podcast that you might be listening to elsewhere. Thank you very much for your support. All right, let's get into the program. And joining me now is Toby Buckle. Hey, Toby, welcome to Theory of Change.
Hey, Matthew. Thanks for having me.
Yes, good to have you. Well, so we have a lot to discuss here. I will confess that some of my favorite episodes are the political philosophy episodes because I think it was as John Maynard Keynes said that the ideas of dead economists and philosophers animate things much more than people realize. And so,
Madmen in authority, hearing voices in the air, are usually distilling their fervour from some academic scribbler.
Yep, that is right. Yeah. So, and to that end, though, you published two pieces that I think are worth discussing together. The first one that you came out with was a discussion of the political philosopher John Rawls, who is somebody who I suspect a lot of people have never heard of. But this guy has a lot of influence on both the UK and the US. So if you could maybe give a little background for people who aren't familiar with him, and then we can go from there.
Yeah, it's an interesting dichotomy, isn't it? In that if you are in political theory, he will be talked about as the most important liberal political philosopher of the 20th century. Possibly the most important political philosopher sort of period, certainly of the latter half. And yet it's not a household name, right? Rawls has never had the cut-through of Marx or Rousseau or something like that. Crowds have never gathered in the streets chanting his slogans. He has had something of an influence at the elite level. So I use Obama as an example. Obama has clearly read Rawls and cites him a few times. It's also the type of thinking that would show up in something like Supreme Court judgments. Something like Planned Parenthood versus Casey is quite Rawlsian in its reasoning. So there's a lot going on with Rawls, and I'm sort of happy to get into whatever particular areas. He wrote big books like Theory of Justice is a doorstopper, Political Liberalism is a doorstopper. These came out in the late 70s and early 90s, respectively, to give you an idea of time frame. But the idea I really zeroed in on is this idea of neutrality. It's actually not how Rawls himself describes it, but it's how we sort of talk about it now. At its simplest, it's the idea that liberalism or the liberal state should be something like the referee of politics, neutrally, fairly deciding between different players in the game. Something like that. And I think that is a way of understanding liberalism that was always a bit confused, but is particularly maladaptive in the current moment. But there's a lot of other stuff to Rawls as well.
This idea of neutrality, though, that it sees liberalism as sort of the having assumed the default position of all of reason and society, science, etc., and says, okay, so therefore now that we won, uh, our job is to manage this situation and to be the referee, as you said, between all the sides and all the constituencies, and to position ourselves as above it all in a lot of ways.
Yeah, so one issue I'd take with that, I'm not saying you're arguing with it, but with that characterization, is yeah, I think that's exactly right. We've won now. Everyone's playing the same game. And so now we'll be the referee. I think that's sort of the thought process of, like I say, elite liberals. This probably wasn't something that, like, your proverbial man on the street thought, but elite, Supreme Court justices, right?
Yeah.
Stevens was huge on neutrality, for instance. The problem with that is he didn't win. Like, people talk about liberal hegemony or the liberal world order, but what liberal hegemony? What liberal world order? The American constitutional design is partially liberal, but partially influenced by other philosophies. Our society is partially liberal, but partially conservative, partially reactionary. Liberal, and what liberal world order? Like, if you look at the governments around the world, there's only a handful of liberal ones. They're mostly conservative or authoritarian regimes. Like, liberalism is one power amongst many. I don't mean to say it's powerless. We have the ability to get our views out there. We have the ability to wield power. We have the ability to fight. But it's not as if we suddenly reached a point sometime in the 90s, or whenever one imagines this to be, where liberalism just won. I don't think that sort of victory is possible. But yet, that is one of the things that this worldview imagines. Or, perhaps to put it more charitably, it imagines a fundamental pluralism of comprehensive worldviews, but that there can be a point in the middle, what Rawlsians call an overlapping consensus, on which everyone agrees. The center of the Venn diagram, where everyone agrees to the basic rules of the constitutional order, and that will be stable and permanent. That's sort of the Rawlsian project. And to a degree, through like I say, maybe the 90s, the early 2000s, you could kind of look at the world and maybe see that. Like, everyone bought into the same set of rules to an extent. But I think it was always a bit illusory to think that consensus could ever be stable or permanent. You get moments of overlap and then moments where they pull apart again.
You do, and I think the reason that they had this illusion was um, that the political right after Nazism and fascism basically, decided, oh well, we can't support these people because they are violent criminals. And so they stopped supporting them. Like that's ultimately what happened. But the memory of that was lost over time, and you see that pretty much in every country. The further away we get from World War II, and the historical, personal, literal memory of fascism, um, the conservative mind seems more willing to make common cause with it. I think that that's what we're seeing here, and the problem for Rawls and other mid 20th century liberals, or people who came of age during that time, is that they mistook something that was a temporary lull, a temporary, I guess, a temporary outbreak of sanity, if you will, among conservatives. They mistook that for them having changed their psychological state, and it was fundamentally erroneous, as you said.
I think we no longer have anyone in living memory of World War II. That has to be part of it. I'd also add a couple of other things. From the 70s through to 2008, you had like a long period of relatively stable and benign macroeconomic conditions, sometimes called the Great Moderation. You don't have these big swings in inflation and interest rates, for instance. You also have a period starting with, I don't know, Goldwater in 64 or something of the Southern strategy, in which Republicans increasingly poach the white anti-civil rights Southern bloc. But what that means is that instead of views about race being aligned to party, they cross-cut parties. So politicians who want to appeal to racism have to do so in a coded way. They have to use dog whistles like states' rights or welfare queens, stuff like this. And I think that allowed an illusion that we were moving beyond these issues, that no one was really a virulent racist anymore. Whereas, in fact, what it was the structures of our political coalitions were acting in such a way that it obfuscated the reality of American racism. Now, what happened through maybe the Obama period is that realignment ends. Everyone in that Southern bloc is now Republican, and anyone who is anti-racist, or at least it's a deal breaker for them, is now Democrat. And so there's no longer that structural incentive to sanitize your language, to talk in dog whistles. Donald Trump can come along and be as overt as he likes about it. And when Donald Trump first starts saying these things in 2016, there's this shock of, oh, you can't say that, because historically you couldn't. There would be consequences within the coalition that the Republicans managed. But Trump didn't create that reality, but he revealed it. He revealed a reality in which views on race now directly tie to political partisanship. So that's another one. There's a few, but through all of those, the overall picture is the same, which is that for us, our current period feels aberrant. It feels disordered and different. Well, it's certainly disordered, but in many senses, this period of fairly benign economic conditions, of cultural consensus, of more civilized speech, that was the aberration. That was the weird, unusual bit. So, a long
Yeah.
way to come back to where you started. I think you're exactly right. I think the sort of type of political culture we were raised into feels like the norm to us because we were raised in it. But that's actually the weird bit or the unusual bit.
Yeah, it is. And the other thing about that post World War II dynamic is that because so much of Europe was completely trashed, uh, everybody knew that the only entities that could pick up the pieces were the government, because the private sector was destroyed. It didn't have the money. It had no power to tax. In many cases, their capacities were literally destroyed. So this was a moment in which it was obvious to pretty much everyone that the government has to step in, and we need to not fear it because the government's really the only thing that can help. And that, I think, did put it was the fact, though, that in the US, there wasn't that mass destruction of the economy. That also made it more possible for these reactionary viewpoints to have currency, because people didn't see the need for government. The thing about government is that it's supposed to be, at least in the mind of liberalism, it's supposed to be there in the background, and you never think about it. It's supposed to be a thing that you rely on but don't really understand, and you don't have to understand. Like, that's the goal of Rawlsian liberalism, is to create a state that takes care of you, and you don't have to know how or why. And the problem is that's unsustainable as a political matter.
Maybe. Although, to complicate that story a little, I don't think it's, because I think the story can sometimes be told that, like, it's just World War II and the aftermath of that, which certainly was a huge part of it. There's also, like, ideological foundations and sort of the ideas and theories being laid decades in advance of that, of, as early as, like, the 1910s, the 1920s, liberalism is increasingly reevaluating how it sees the role of the state. It's increasingly reevaluating how it conceptualizes, both practically and morally, questions of poverty, of inequality. And, you get the reform movements of that sort of era. And then, through the 30s and so on, you have the age of Keynes, you have the age of ideas about a more attractive state gaining, a more active, state gaining increasing currency, both in elite circles and also sort of the population. So by the time you come to the end of World War One, there's almost already this blueprint that, economists and elite thinkers have designed about what they want to do with the new world order. And you get, FDR and all of that in the US. You get the Beveridge Report in the UK, which really is a sort of fundamental redesign of the society. But it's not something that just came out of nowhere. This was sort of in the intellectual work for decades. And then, ultimate causality is always really hard, right, with these things. Like, why did things happen? But then in many ways, when you get the sort of Reagan and Thatcher revolutions, it's sort of the same in reverse, in that the ideas, the economic theories, the political philosophies that have been gaining salience and have been gaining elite adherents are the conservative or the neoliberal or the libertarian. And then, of course, that reverses it all. So it's a story about material conditions and where we were left in the aftermath of World War II, certainly. It's also just a story from an idealist point of view, right? Not meaning idealist in the sense of starry-eyed, but idealist in the sense that ideas matter and change the world, in that liberal ideas, socialist ideas even, had been making real headway in particularly the interwar years, both among the population, but also, crucially, elite capture. And then through the sort of middle of the latter half of the 20th century, a much more conservative or restrictive vision of the state really made headway and captured elites. Something like that.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. And to go back to one of the things you said initially there, that this was a time when liberalism, it became apparent that they were winning the war, and it became apparent to them that also, if you didn't want Marxism to win, then you had to make some major concessions to the broader general public. So I think, yeah, these are things that happen. But as part of this liberal imagination phase that was there in the, let's say, the 1920s through the 50s, let's say, um, it was a lot of it also was harkening back to the ideas of Immanuel Kant, and who was the muse of John Rawls, of
Mm.
course. And but in the case of the New World Order, so called, that was set up post World War II. I mean, very much of it, so much of it was a an attempt to refound the League of Nations, which itself was born out of the philosophy of Kant, and his project of creating a political philosophy that was so completely denaturated, if you will, that it was designed like this referee posture that you're talking about. This was Kant. Kant was the one who invented this and said, this is what liberalism needs to be because we keep killing ourselves over religion and over territoriality. And so instead, if we can abstract those things and just sort of put them on the shelf and say, well, liberalism won't touch religion and it won't touch nationalities and culture, then that's the ticket to human progress. And in some ways, he was right. But as a political matter, this was a disastrous idea.
Do you think there's a connection? So yeah, Rawls is definitely intellectually sort of downstream of Kant. Here's something I've been thinking of. I don't have a great answer to. Do you think there's a connection between this sort of neutral liberalism versus comprehensive debate and like meta-ethical questions? Because what Kant's really known for is a sort of rule-based
Oh,
approach to
absolutely. Yeah.
ethics, right? Whereas, if you take John Stuart Mill, who I contrast Rawls with, he's obviously a famous utilitarian. Now, that's not one for one. I can imagine, you could be a deontological, comprehensive liberal or utilitarian, neutral liberal, but they do tend to run that way. Do you see those things as connected?
Oh, I absolutely do. And the reason being that, so for Kant, that for Mill and the original generation of liberals, what they were trying to do was to create a political philosophy based on human potentiality and to
Yeah.
unlock it. And both to enable the individual to do that, but also to enable the state to reach aggregate human potential to necessitate that. And as an example, I would talk about the book Looking Backward by Edward Bellamy, which was effectively a socialism of a Christian sort, but he called it nationalism, which is interesting. And so it was a somatic liberalism, if you will, a liberalism that was aware of the body and aware of where one comes from, phenomenological, if you will. That's the original roots of liberalism, and Kant uh, responding to, given where he was as a German, that was the crossroads of all of these, the bloodiest wars in human history up until that time when he was alive, and so he said, well, we can't risk this idea of human potentiality, and what we have to do instead is to re-articulate liberalism as deontology. So deon meaning duty from the Greek. But
Yeah,
the
sorry, I probably should have defined that word because that's a bit of a jargon word. If you want to help do that for us.
yeah, deontology, coming from the Greek word deon meaning duty, is what he wanted to move liberalism toward. And the horrible paradox is that now this isn't the etymological root of the word, but de-ontology, meaning anti-reality. That is actually kind of what Kantian liberalism and Rawlsian liberalism is. It is a denial of human nature and a denial of the attempt to enable it that earlier liberalism was. And that's fundamentally the reason why liberalism is in such dire straits in the current moment, I would say.
That's interesting. I mean, in none of my public writing on this, have really connected it through to meta-ethics. But it's worth noting, perhaps, that both Rawls and Nozick, who are kind of the two philosophers you'd get taught in like an intro to political philosophy 101 for the longest time, and in many ways were kind of the totems of centre left and centre right thinking for a long time. You know, Rawls on the one hand, you've got fairness, justice, discourse norms. Nozick, you've got rights, freedom, limited state, right? Both of them start with a rejection of utilitarianism. They both, state anarchy, utopia, and theory of justice, both start by going, well, obviously utilitarianism is wrong, and we're going to distance ourselves from that. And the reasons they do so are quite weak. Like, Nozick has this thought experiment about hitting a donkey on the head with a baseball bat, and sure. But it's interesting, they both feel the need to start with that. I don't know how much weight I'd put into that. Because also that's not a public debate in any way. People aren't factionalizing about this among the population. But it is interesting to hear you draw that link.
Yeah, well, thanks. And I do think that is also this deontology, this duty-based morality. It also is the cause of the phenomenon that you document in the other column that we're going to talk about here today. You had written recently about how the political ideology or political tactic of what is sometimes called reactionary centrism in the United States. Now, I happen to think that term is a very problematic term and confusing to people who are on the progressive side of things. But nonetheless, what you said in terms of the implications of it are very true. So, but before we get into why I think that reactionary centrism is a bad term, just if you can give us a little overview of your argument in the piece about the idea of never holding the right wing accountable for its actions or trying to philosophically oppose them from a moral argument.
Yeah, so there's been a few different accounts of this. It's not my term, to be fair. I picked it up from. It's sort of been it's quite a recent term. I think it was coined in early Trump era, I believe. But I just sort of picked it up, I must admit, quite uncritically. One of the things I've argued is pretty key to understanding divisions amongst people who are not overt Trump supporters is the idea of agency in politics. And I've made this key to my understanding of reactionary centrism, although other people have defined it somewhat differently, but I think we all have roughly the same idea in mind. So, agency. Do we see the political right, Donald Trump, as an action or a reaction? If we look at, say, popular dislike of minorities, be it immigrants or, say, trans people, do we see that as a backlash to the overzeal of social justice, a reaction, or do we see it as an action, as a top-down propaganda campaign to inspire hatred of those groups? Now, for myself, I'm firmly on the action side. Fascism is a gentle ideology. It has ideas, plans, and goals for the rest of us. Most of, in fact, the last decade has been liberals responding to things it has done, and not the other way round. But nonetheless, there are many people who have a sort of, I guess at its simplest, you could say a reaction to woke narrative, right? Or a reaction to fill in the blank of what you find annoying about liberalism. If only liberals hadn't done X and provoked the right. So that's why I think that's why I gravitated towards the term reactionary. It's the reaction part that defines them. Now, what it means, if you see the world that way, is that you tend to spend a lot of time asking for empathy for the reactive party. If the right are merely reacting, then, well, you've got to see it from their point of view, don't you understand? If you were in their shoes, you'd feel the same. And it means we spend very little time at all, maybe none, asking to see it from the point of view of the supposed provoking party, the type of person I'm describing when I say reactionary centrist. Virtually never, indeed really never, would say something like, well, yes, these woke kids on college campuses protesting are a bit annoying, but look, see it from their point of view. Understand the legitimate grievances that are inspiring them to say that. They never say that. The right cannot be blamed, but it should be understood. The left can be blamed and needn't be understood. That's the basic posture. And I pair that with centrist because I do think amongst this tribe, there is an instinctive conformist predisposition to position themselves in the centre. Now, what you might be about to go on to say, and what many people have said, and I've heard from social media today, is, but they're not really centrists. That's more of just a posture, right? Sure, fine. I don't know what's in anyone's soul, and I'm not really claiming to. I would say the centre. So I've described the reactionary side, seeing Trump as a reaction. The centrist side, yeah, I grant, is more of an affect. They're not a true centrist in that they criticise both sides equally, but they nonetheless like to position themselves as being in the centre. They like to present themselves, and I think genuinely see themselves, as being the grown-up in the room, the sensible one, the one adjudicating it and sorting it all out. It's not it's a bit of a different idea, but it's not a totally different idea to this one of neutrality that we've been talking about. It is a bit distinct. They like to be seen as, and I think see themselves as, the reasonable one. But it's not, I don't think, and we can maybe disagree on this, it's not a principled centrism. So you could imagine someone who's in the political centre because that is just genuinely what they think, or perhaps someone who has conflicted views, someone who's socially left and economically right, say, who finds themselves in the middle by virtue of that. I don't think it's that with reactionary centrists because they slide around too much. They argue too many different things. I think it's more like they want to be seen as the mature grown-up who's in the middle of more dogmatic people. I think it's more like that. But anyway, those are the two sides, and why that's why it connects for me as a term, because both of those sides have a story to them, the reactionary and the centrist. But it's been a persistent sort of way of thinking about the world in both the UK and the US.
Yeah, I think it has. And but so for people who don't follow UK politics, though, I think you cite your prime minister as a perfect example of this mentality.
Yeah.
For those who aren't following, though, Americans, I think you have a very good case in regards to him.
Was that an
I'm asking.
invitation to make it?
It was, yes. So please do.
Okay. Yeah, so our Prime Minister's called Keir Starmer. He's the leader of the Labour Party, which I guess is a very rough analogue. He is like the Democrats. It's our main centre-left party, although the UK party system's a bit more complicated, but we needn't go into that. We've had a long period of Conservative rule, I think 14 years, going back to David Cameron's victory in 2010. Starmer came in about a year, almost exactly a year ago now. He just passed his year anniversary, with quite a significant victory. And this isn't like in the US where there's checks and balances and divided powers. It's essentially like whoever controls the House of the Representative wins and nothing else matters, right? So he has a free hand to do what he wants in a way that really no US president has. Now, he ran as a moderate. I think he was self-consciously course-correcting against Jeremy Corbyn, who was the previous Labour Party leader, who was a strongly left figure, and who led the party to a couple of general election defeats in 2017 and 2019. And so we were all always expecting a moderate, nobody, like maybe like a Tony Blair or Bill Clinton type figure, right? Like nobody expected this guy to be like a Bernie Sanders or whatever. What's really become clear since then is the two instincts I described, that the right must be understood and appeased, and that you try and find a position in the middle. Now, over the last year, our right on a number of issues have really frickin' radicalized, as is happening in many places, right? And Starmer has moved in that attempt to find a middle ground wildly to the right, much more so than even any of your more centrist Democrats have. Um, so, on like, to give you just one example, we're now in the process of doing a bathroom bill in the UK, excluding all trans people from all gendered spaces. So, in other words, not only can a trans women not use the women's toilets, they also, under the I think a plausible reading of the new EHRC guidance, can't use the men's either, so just can't leave the house effectively. That is a very, very radical proposition that is not just well to the right of Starmer's previous commitments, it's well to the right of previous Conservative governments' commitments, it's well to the right of many US, not just Democrats, but many US Republicans. He's also swinging to the right on immigration. And at every stage, doing this reactionary centrist thing of saying, look, I get it, I understand, I see it from your point of view, which is what reactionary centrists tell us you're supposed to say to the right. So he said recently, someone asked him the question, how would you feel if your daughter had to walk past a hotel housing refugees, asylum seekers, which is obviously playing on this idea that non-white men are a threat to white women, right? That's what the question's implying. To which he said, and I quote directly, I get it.
Yeah. As
You
if
know,
they were going to do anything to her. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah,
and
their
I
mere
think there's
presence
an
is a crime.
easy answer on the table for him there. That's your chance to draw a moral red line without having to without having to be. I'm not even saying he needs to be like a radical socialist or anything. It would be nice, but I think what he could have just said there is absolutely, I would feel fine with my daughter walking past refugees, of course. Now, that's not to say there's not problems with the current system. There's a huge backlog of asylum cases, and it's inefficient, and we were handed a mess from the past government. And people are concerned about their taxpayer money being spent on this, and I understand all of that, but let's not validate those really ugly fears. You know, you could have said, listen, I understand there's practical concerns, but it was such a perfect opportunity for him to draw a moral red line, and he wouldn't.
No, he wouldn't. But and this it gets to the why I do think the term reactionary centrism is misleading and
Mm,
inaccurate, and that is because it's actually masking two different philosophies or perspectives, and it's eliding them. So the first perspective is conservatism.
mm,
Like the so many people in the U.S., UK, and many other countries will self-identify as liberal, but in
mm,
fact they are conservative, and we've seen that with so many people that when Joe Biden was the president, they were people like Tulsi Gabbard or people
mm,
like Joe Rogan. There's just a lot, so many of these individuals who, when before Trump, looked like he was able to execute his comeback, they were self-identifying as, oh, I'm on the left. I'm on the left. But if you looked at their philosophical commitments, their policy viewpoints, their epistemic origins, nothing they believed was liberal. They were, in fact, conservative the entire time. They were libertarian. If you want to be generous to these viewpoints, like Barry Weiss is another one, that this is a person who for her entire career has pretended, oh, I'm a liberal, I just don't like the left. And it's like,
Mm.
well, then in what way are you a liberal? Tell me how you are a liberal. So it masks. So I would say the majority of these people who are described as reactionary centrists are actually conservatives, and the improper elision of conservatives into liberalism makes it so that they spend their energies fighting the left rather than fighting the crazy lunatics in their own side and the people who agree with them. And so because they're just like, well, I don't like them, so I don't have to fight them. You guys are at least more you believe in reason, so I'm going to be over here and I'm going to tell you what to do. And it's like, well, that's not quite how it works. And and me as a former one of these people, um, I can I self-identified as a conservative liberal. That was what I called myself, or a liberal conservative. I guess it depended on my mood the day if you asked me that question. And except for in my case, I was honest enough to admit that I was conservative. And then the other phenomenon, though, that I think that is improperly elided in the term reactionary centrism is that not only does centrism not really exist as a philosophical viewpoint, it's also that this tendency is, to whatever extent that it's sincere and not just pure, Machiavellianism, to the extent that it actually is sincere, this is pathological liberalism. That's what it is, and it is this Rawlsian Kantianism that we've been talking about here. Because they don't think that. Well, let me step back. So it's this Rawlsian Kantian deontology viewpoint in which they correctly note that reactionary viewpoints are psychologically disturbed, that they are not intellectually based. And so their viewpoint, instead of saying, wow, we have tens of millions of people who are psychologically disturbed and in need of severe mental health interventions by the government to help them, instead of saying that, they say, well, this is just how they are, and we have to accommodate their views in some way, instead of telling the general public, hey, these people are fucking dangerous and they're coming for your rights.
Well,
They don't do that.
reactionary centrists, I think two things that are pretty universal in that tribe is a real concern about not being rude or mean to reactionaries. You can't say that about them, you know?
No.
And also this idea, like you said, that they're unpersuadable,
Yeah.
that you can't move public opinion. If people hate immigrants, they hate immigrants, and we've just got to feed that hunger. I think that's all right. I find it interesting. Like, are they sincere, or like, is this? Are they even further? Are they like self-consciously fraudulent about this? I don't know. I don't know what's. In some ways, I find this like the hardest section of the ideological landscape to wrap my head around, because this is like in many ways the one least like myself. As like a progressive, comprehensive liberal. Um, I certainly agree there's not a comprehensive philosophy behind this. It's not like liberalism, socialism. You've got a whole library of books there, right, that you can go back to as like an intellectual tradition. There's no real intellectual tradition behind centrism, nor do centrists themselves even really claim it. It's more like a disposition. As to like, are they really conservative? I think they're certainly in many cases sympathetic to conservatism, and they're certainly annoyed by the left. I almost wonder, in terms of like what ideology they are really.
Well,
Is there even one at all? Like when I look at
well,
Keir Starmer,
yeah,
like does he actually? Because I could rewind the tape not that long ago, 3 or 4 years ago, and find him saying the exact opposite to what he's saying now, and professing the
yeah.
exact opposite values. And it's not even as if there was a moment where he said, you know what, I've really thought about this and I've changed my mind. He's just saying different stuff now. So
Yeah.
to maybe like to give another case, Obama, right? I wouldn't call Obama a reactionary centrist. He does definitely dabble in this sort of neutralist liberalism. Obama's interestingly actually read Rawls, unlike a lot of politicians who are downstream of this. But when Obama changed his mind on gay marriage, he does this big speech where he said, I used to believe marriage was between a man and a woman, but I sat down and I talked about it with my daughters, and I really came to say, now maybe that's all BS, right? But he felt the need to tell a story about why he changed his values, because Obama, unlike Starmer perhaps, isn't an idiot, and he gets that that's how normal people think about politics. They think about it through the lens of values, and they want their leaders to have values consistency. Maybe you change the details on a policy, but we want to know that your core values are stable. And so if he's going to change something that impacts values, he knows he needs to have a story why. With Starmer, there's no story. I wonder if the guy actually just doesn't have deep values of either sort in any sense. He's just sort of saying what he thinks he needs to say. Like, it's actually as dumb and vacuous as that. I have no idea. I don't know what's in his head. But somehow, if the lights weren't on in there, that actually wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah. Well, and here's the thing, though. This is why they're conservative, because that is literally what Edmund Burke said is the essence of conservatism, that it is not a system of beliefs, but rather a disposition. And if you read your Michael Oakeshott, that's also what Michael Oakeshott says.
Quote, for philosophic purposes, it is enough that the conservatives sit and think. For practical purposes, it is enough that he sit.
Yeah, exactly. And so much of especially Oakeshott, because Burke, was more of just a conventional politician in many ways, dealing with specific particular issues. Whereas Oakeshott, he didn't have such obligations, so he was able to just, sit there and write political theory. And what he did basically is provide the intellectual justification for the attitude you just described, and it is conservatism. And because it's the idea that we decide things based upon what is the correct or advantageous idea within the moment, and don't call it unprincipled, because in fact our principle is pragmatism, and so that's why I do think that it's important to stop calling conservatives centrist or liberals. These are conservatives, and they just don't realize it. So Kirsten Sinema is an example of this conservative viewpoint, but also so is Joe Manchin. That these are people who they prefer the status quo ante, and they don't want change to be too fast, and they have no consistent ideological program. Well, that's conservatism. It's not liberalism. It's not centrism.
See, I have a bit of a different model of conservatism, and it'd be interesting if you disagree as a former conservative, that would maybe put a bit of a distinction between that and what I'm describing as reactionary centrism. Although, I should say off the bat, I'm not really at pains to defend reactionary centrists in any way. This is not my tribe of people or something I'm at all sympathetic to. So I'm not coming from the point of view of trying to protect dear old Keir, but so in my sort of model of the world, conservatism isn't just about a distrust of change. It's a bit thicker than that, although this can largely be at a subconscious level. It's about a view of human society as being ordered by things that are beyond our control. That there is, in the ideological theorist Michael Frieden's words, an extra-human origin of the social order. Now, this can change in different types of conservatism. Back in the day, it could be today, in fact, it could be the laws of God. It could be the laws of the free market. It could be the gender binary and the supposedly, set things that it is to be a man and a woman, and the set social roles that need to follow from that. It's not that conservatism is opposed to change exactly. it wants us to return to that underlying social order. Conservatives can be very radical indeed when they feel like we've gotten away from that social order, be it the Thatcher and Reagan revolutions wanting to bring us back to the laws of the free market, or something like Trumpism wanting to bring us back to these purportedly natural hierarchies of race and gender. Now, obviously, people can share that to a greater or lesser degree. I would say more that reactionary centrists certainly can drift into that. Certainly, there's a clear path where reactionary centrists start as like, oh, I'm in the middle, and end as being conservative. We see that all the time. But I wonder if it's dumber than that. Like, they just fundamentally don't have a vision of society or of change. But they know that liberals kind of annoy them, you know? And that when they see conservatives, they perceive them as a bit more authentic and empathetic because they perceive them as male. I think that's it. We can talk about the gender element to that, but I think that's a big part of it. And they just don't find the excesses of the right annoying in the same way as they find the excesses of the left, but they don't know why. But there's not I don't know. I don't know what's in other people's heads. I really don't. My gut instinct with a lot of these people is there's really nothing behind the eyes, but I could be wrong.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it is. Yeah, it's hard to say for specific people. I would agree
Mm.
with you there. But, to your point though about the kind of the larger epistemic vision that is at play here. So the conservative economist and philosopher Thomas Sowell actually has written on this particular topic, and in his view, and I think it's largely correct that he says that politics is essentially a conflict between two different visions of humanity and human nature, and one is the constrained vision, and the other is the unconstrained vision. And so the conservative and reactionary viewpoint is, well, there's just certain things to how humans are, and most people are terrible and stupid, and so therefore the weak should suffer what they must, and the strong should do what they will. That is
That kind of
largely the
that kind of fits with the story about social order I've said, right? They clearly
yeah.
reinforce each other. If there's like a set thing that is human nature, then it would seem to follow from that there's a set thing that is society. But if human nature is quite changeable and adaptable, that would
Yeah.
also sort of imply that society is and could potentially that would seem to imply a more futurist vision than a recalcitrant vision. So
Yeah.
I don't think those two things are in conflict necessarily. Those are just two different. They're two sides of the same coin. I think.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm saying is that if you
Yeah.
have
Okay.
the constrained viewpoint, that is what makes you on the political right. And if you have the unconstrained viewpoint, then that's what makes you on the political left. And so that's when we go back to circle back to what you were saying about kind of the Nozick and Rawls idea. In some sense, they actually are joining the constrained vision, and so it is arguably a form of conservatism that they're advancing in their philosophies, even though they would never say that and never, would blanch at the at the assertion of that.
I think there's definitely a thing where more people are sympathetic to conservatism than would willingly endorse the label. That seems.
Absolutely.
I don't have like data to that effect, but like that feels intuitively true to me.
Yeah, and I would say probably some really great examples of that are the linguist and popular science writer Steven Pinker, who
Mm,
claims to be a liberal, but in fact everything he does is about justifying libertarian conservatism. So he's not
yeah,
religious, and
I'd
he's
agree with you when it comes to Pinker. I think, yeah.
yeah. So, but at the same time, he self-identifies as a liberal. And the same thing is also true about Sam Harris. So during my time on the political right, I saw Sam Harris as somebody exactly like me, somebody who was non-religious, but also realistic about human nature. Now, and I knew, of course, that he described himself as a liberal. But this is it does go back to the fact that I think that Sol was fundamentally correct in that. But you said had told me off the air that you had listened to Harris quite a bit here, so I'm curious on what you think about that with him.
Sam Harris, yeah. I mean, I followed the sort of new atheist movement for a bit. I must admit, I haven't listened to Harris in a long time. So, um, yeah, I think with Harris, you also have a fairly good case of someone with conservative values using liberal language to sort of justify them, right? Because look, in a sense, right, political ideologies are many things. They are these value systems, they are sets of policies, they are intellectual traditions, they are also just sort of languages for talking. You can talk about rights and freedom and free speech. It's sort of a language. You can apply it to, you can express different ideas in that language, and you can express conservative ideas in that language. I mean, Harris also seems to my mind, and I'm sort of doing the thing of like pretending I know what's in someone's head and I don't, um, of being incredibly thin-skinned. Like it seems like he's got some pushback from people on the social justice left who are angry about what he said about Muslims, say, right? Um, and he's found that criticism so enraging. Whether let's just table whether it was legitimate or not. So enraging that he's essentially become a quasi-fascist, like in response to it. And I kind of don't know what to do about that. I think often when people have this reaction narrative, they're not talking about the public, they're talking about themselves, you know? Like, I don't think many people out there are becoming fascists because they had to attend a DEI seminar. I think most people roll their eyes at it like every other useless work meeting and then get on with their day. But, like, I don't know, Sam really let social justice criticism get under his skin in a big way. Like, he couldn't let it go, was my impression of him.
I think so. Yeah, absolutely. That is the case. That he blew up at all that. And again, like when you go back to his, uh, to his moral philosophy, he's extremely Kantian, and he's kind of he's a conservative Kantian. That's what he is. That he wrote an entire book called "The Moral Landscape," in which he
I
argued
have read
that
it.
that in which he argued that morality could be scientific, and that you could have objectively true moral viewpoints.
Now, see, I don't
Now, these are
wholly agree
nonsensical
with some of the
views.
moral landscape in that he's coming from like a sort of consequentialist worldview, which I largely buy. And I think a consequentialist worldview is sort of more correct in a sense. But his clear target there is a sort of imagined left moral relativism, a sort of
Yeah.
multicultural moral relativism. That's clearly what he's got in his head to go after
Oh, yeah.
in that book, right? Now, I'd actually agree as an object level point that I don't think relativism is a particularly good foundation for pluralism or multiculturalism, because I think some people will say, oh, well, we don't really know who's right, therefore multiculturalism. But if you don't really know who's right, then what's to say that we shouldn't be respecting Hitler's views, you know? So I think there are better ways of thinking about and justifying pluralism, but I think that's what Sam has in his head and he's going after in that book.
Oh, I think so. Yeah. And I mean, this is the classic atheist reflex, though. If you go back through history, that, there is this reflexive notion that, well, I must have an objective moral basis for my viewpoints. And I mean, for me, I'm more sympathetic to the Greek sophists or the Epicureans or the academic skeptics in this regard. That I think that we can say that certain things are probably true, or functionally true, but whether something is more than that, is objectively true, well, that's actually not possible. And David Hume really destroyed that idea. And no one listened to him fully, except for the scientists. But he was actually making it in many ways as a political point, and no one listened.
I'd also say, and this is a bit perhaps meta-ethical, that when, in the case particularly of political ideologies, something like liberalism or conservatism, when we ask, are they true? We're kind of asking a series of related but separate questions. Are they internally coherent? Broadly speaking, are these sorts of, for instance, we just talked about, is the theme of a set human nature coherent with the idea of a changing society, right? Is the story they're telling a coherent one? Is it externally coherent? Does it seem to be validated by facts about the world? They're also languages. You can ask if they're a better or worse language, a more or less persuasive language. You can ask, they're also like guides to life, right? These are sort of toolkits for, probably at a largely subconscious level, getting us through our day to day and just helping nudge us along with the small and unimportant moral decisions that we sort of have to make along the way. You know, um, is it good for that? And those answers might not all cohere down to an ultimate point where it's like this exact version of liberalism, that's the one that's true. One of the points I made, to bring it all the way back to the beginning in the Rawls article, is there's kind of two issues I take with the neutralist liberalism. One is I don't think it's very good philosophy. I think the claims that are being made on a philosophical level just don't sit very well together. But the second one is that I think in the current moment it's less persuasive. That if you want to activate people to oppose a rising far right, say, you need to appeal to something a bit thicker, a bit more sort of flesh and blood than this idea of the neutral, gentlemanly referee. You've got to talk about the types of lives that you want people to have. You've got to talk about how freedom and pluralism are good, and I like living in a free society, and I don't want to lose this, and I don't want the next generation to grow up having worse lives than I do. You've got to make these sorts of claims, right? And it's that confluence that makes it a compelling case for me, and something that I'd want to push, is those don't necessarily have to go together. Something could be philosophically cohesive, but not particularly persuasive, or vice versa. I think it's that it's both. I think that it's bad philosophy, and I think particularly in the current moment, it it doesn't seem persuasive. I think that it's both of them makes it a door that I want to push, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. And the problem with this as a political strategy, it is both bad philosophy and bad politics. Is that from a political standpoint, if you are calibrating your policies or your rhetoric in pursuit of these elusive or usually imaginary voters, that you actually will never reach them, because their objections to you are not based on the things that they say. So, in other words, if somebody says, well, they spend all their time obsessing about trans people, or they spend
Mm,
all their time obsessing about how they hate Black Lives Matter. And,
mm,
if you, and the U.S. has the same issue, with there are some political strategists who advocate for what they call popularism,
mm,
which is that, well, we should only have policies that are popular. And Matt Iglesias is an example of somebody who says this. And the problem is, though, that if you only pursue policies that are popular and you discard policies that are unpopular, then essentially what happens is that your policies become less and less popular. Your native policies, the policies that actually are passionate to you, that you care about, those will be discarded as well, because the whole point of politics is to argue for your own perspective and why it should be the law, not well, let's just do what the people want. No, the people should do what I want. And here's why. And it's a fundamental misunderstanding of what politics is for, when you do it this way. And this is why the right in the United States is getting ever radicalized, because the left establishment never says, hey, actually, public, here's what our moral vision is. Here's what we want to do for you. And these people are fucking liars and criminals. And you should stop them. They don't say that.
The Democrats are, in some of them at least, are like Pritzker or something, or AOC. I think there are examples within the Democratic coalition
Yeah.
who are sort of behaving in the
A
way
handful. Yeah.
we'd want them to. Yo, they're better than Labour, okay? Like, Jesus Christ, nothing will make you appreciate Democrats more than Keir Starmer's Labour Party. I think that's right. I think also you talked about putting a values vision forward. I think people like Matt Iglesias, politics to them is all about policy. It's all about finding a policy consensus. And sure, policies matter. But people also, I think primarily actually, judge politics through the lens of values. And what you can often do with these policy compromises is make your values proposition hopelessly incoherent. Now, it's fine to tinker, it's fine, you know, but you can get to the point, and I think Starmer in the UK is a great example of it, where the policies you're putting forward are just. So, with what Starmer's putting forward on immigration or trans rights, is making the values proposition hopelessly incoherent. He's simultaneously saying that he believes in liberal core values and that he doesn't. And to the right, that just appears hopelessly inauthentic and pandering. And to the left, it feels like a betrayal. Like, that's the limit. You have to have a policy vision. Certainly, you have to have, here's the things we're going to do with the country. But you also have to have the why. This is what we're doing it for. And I think people like Matt, it's all about we'll just give the people the policies that they want, and they have no sense of, because they have no sense of the why themselves, because they have no values themselves, they're very poorly placed to understand the motivations of people who do, which is most people and most voters.
Well, yeah, I think that's right. And so the like the Republican Party before Trump was in this same kind of meta political loop, if you will, that the Democratic Party has continuously been in, and Labor is currently. That the Republican Party for so long, they had this anti-government standpoint, which they knew was horribly unpopular and no one liked, and their own voters didn't like. So I mean, when you look at surveys, when people ask Republicans, when pollsters ask Republicans, so what should we spend less on? And they give them 20 different issues. Usually, about the only thing Republicans say they want to spend less on is foreign aid. That's it. So they don't want to actually go for this anti-government libertarianism that the Republican Party before Trump, that's what they were devoted to. And yet at the same time, they wanted to hold on to that vision. And so what they would basically have to do is just kind of pretend to, around the edges, to have a more pro government viewpoint. So they would say things like George H.W. Bush had his 1,000 points of light. We're a kinder and gentler America, and his son would say things like compassionate conservatism, and so they would have all of these viewpoints, and as you said, with regard to the left and this pathological liberalism, that no one liked these viewpoints. No one wanted compassionate conservatism. No one wanted 1,000 points of light. Everyone saw it for what it was, as just blatant, naked, electioneering, and so it was just disgusting. And so when Trump came along and said, "Fuck that," let's just tell people that we want to lock up people, and that we want to be racist, and that we want to be sexist. Let's just fucking go. And that was exactly what the party wanted, the voters wanted, and that was why he won. Because, like, I remember when Trump was in that primary of his first primary in 2015. I wrote an article in October of 2015 saying Donald Trump will win the Republican nomination based on these trends and based on the fact that he has support across all of the ideological groups in the party. And it's his race to lose. And people pushed back on me. They said, I can't believe you would say that. That's just ridiculous. How can you say such a thing?
Were you
And
still on the right at that point, or had you left
well,
by then?
at that point, I was not. And I had
You were
largely,
writing that as an ex-conservative.
yeah, or at least as a very, very disenchanted one, because like in some sense, for me, Trump was in that beginning point in time, if you remember, like the Never Trump movement started because they thought Trump was not right wing enough. That was actually why they hated him, with the exception of foreign policy stuff. So those people, the neocon hawks were the exception, but everyone else thought that he was just a Democrat in disguise. That's why they didn't like him. But now, in my case, I wanted Trump to be against Republican anti-government orthodoxy. I liked that about him, and I thought that if he lost big, that it would be a possible sign of progress, and that the libertarian wackos would be thrown out on their ear, and something better could happen. But that's not what happened. And needless to say, but after the administration came into office, I had not completely renounced the Republican Party by that time, but I was offered a job in the Trump White House, writing speeches for him. And but I couldn't do it though, because I thought, well, number one, I don't want my words coming out of the mouth of this total buffoon. But also that I wouldn't ever want to write words justifying, some of his more monstrous viewpoints, which had by then become, very apparent in Muslim bans and things like that. So, like that's but I mean, that's my long way of saying that, yes, you're right that, when you refuse to offer a clear moral vision to the public, well, then they're not going to support you. People support someone who will do something, even if they don't necessarily agree with it. Like that's the thing that the popularists or the neoliberals, they still haven't figured that out. The abundance, agenda stuff and all that. None of that means anything because, as you said, people, they don't vote on policies. In many cases, people have no idea what the policies are. Like when people ask, if you like people, sometimes you'll see man on the street interviews where they'll come up to people and they'll say, Donald Trump just said this, and they'll quote some, pro-abortion rights statement, and they'll say, well, what do you think about Donald Trump saying this? And the Trump supporters will say, oh yeah, that's good. They have no
My,
idea.
my favourite one of those is they polled Americans on if they'd support military intervention in Agrabah, the fictional setting of Aladdin, and people
Yeah,
had views. People like
they did.
34% of Americans supported military intervention. Yeah, it just seems like this is the thing with reactionary centrists, right? Is they claim to sort of be the representative of the common man. They're going to let us effete academics know, like what the real, salt of the earth voters in Ohio are thinking, right? They're deeply in touch with them. But I've honestly never met people who are more out of touch with how normal people think politically most of the time. Because most people, to use a simplified typology, and this is a bit of a simplification, but between values and policy, most people do not have detailed policy views. There might be like one specific thing that they know about. Like if they work for a local high school, they will know about education policy, right? Or, whatever it might be for them. Or they might be one thing that is their hobby horse. Like every smoker in the world I know can cite chapter and verse on exactly why anti-marijuana laws are wrong, right? But overall, people aren't reading like policy blueprints and stuff. And their policy views are quite changeable and quite fungible. Even something as, do you support X? Or do you support Donald Trump's plan for X? Or do you support Bernie Sanders' plan for X? We'll get you like 60-point swings in what people think, right? But, because people immediately jump from that to people aren't political or people are stupid, but people do have reasonably clear and coherent and stable over time senses of their values, right? Like, for a lot of people on the left, that I'm a sort of tolerant, open-minded person. I believe in difference. I believe in diversity. That's definitely real. And like it's consistent. And reactionary centrism is all about the policy, right? But in a sense, that's not how voters think. They think in
That's
terms of
abnormal.
value,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
And I think there's this idea that, like, so this is why I push back against the reaction narrative, that, oh, it's just because of wokeness went too far and there was a reaction, right? It's not that your voter in Ohio at a working class diner has like personally experienced these woke college kids on campus telling him about intersectionality. It's that he's heard about it through Ben Shapiro or something like that, right? That's the causality. And why does that matter? It matters because if you think it's all a reaction to woke, then you have to destroy woke. That's the root cause of it. So you have to say, all you guys need to shut up and never talk again. Oh, and by the way, if trans people could like stop existing, that would be great. We're going to do what the UK government is doing and basically outlaw you, which, by the way, has catastrophically hurt Labour in the polls. Their rightward lurch, it's not working for them, which is exactly what my model of the world would represent. Labour are going to the right on immigration, they're going to the right on trans rights, and it's collapsing their polling for them. Why? Because it wasn't ever about anything objective or real. It's about what they were being told about those issues by the right-wing press, right? That's the underlying problem. And you see that actually in the empirics. In the UK case, I imagine it's similar in the US. Public concern about immigration moves one for one with the news's coverage of it. The news fearmongers about it more, concern goes up. Less it goes down. It's like it's absolutely the two lines on the graph are like the same. So this reactionary centrist posture is what we said before. It's both wrong, but also I just don't think it will work. It's
No, it
both
doesn't.
it's both wrong to say, oh, we're going to throw immigrants and trans people under the bus. I also don't think it will work because those concerns aren't coming from the actual number of immigrants or anything that anyone on the social justice side is saying. Those concerns are coming from the right-wing news and right-wing propaganda and right-wing new media. That's the problem. And that problem remains.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's
No matter what policy concession you make, it doesn't touch it because it was never about policy to begin with. Sorry.
yeah, that oh yeah. No, your point is absolutely correct because, the basically you have people who are going for um, Donald Trump or going for Nigel Farage. They are doing it primarily for two reasons, and neither of them is about policy. One, the main reason for the main block of them, the bulk of them, is they are psychologically disposed toward authoritarian viewpoints, and sort of historical naturalism. In other words, that if a group was historically dominant, then it is natural that that group is dominant, and we must sustain that dominance. And whether it is a viewpoint from religious fundamentalism or from social Darwinism, doesn't matter. It's still the same psychological viewpoint. So that's most of the Farage and Trump voters. But then there's the smaller percentage is people who, as you said, that are motivated by reactionary propaganda. And so, but with this first group though, literally no issue actually is motivating them. So in other words, if Joe Biden or if Keir Starmer had taken the right wing position wholesale and just copied it, well, then the right wing would move on to another issue. Like they're
More
not,
or less what's happening in the UK
yeah,
without
which is,
exaggeration.
yeah, and that is because the goal of reactionaries is not to find that policy center, of that Rawlsian center. Their goal is to overthrow democracy and create fascism. So when you compromise with them in the vain hope that you're going to somehow mollify them, you will never. There's literally no position that you can take that will make them stop what they're doing, other than to destroy democracy itself.
Do you think reactionary centrists know that? Because it
No, I don't.
seems
They do not.
right. So that's right. That's why I think they're conceptually distinct from conservatives. Because like, does Keir Starmer know that he's laying the groundwork for fascism? Again, who knows what's in the guy's head? My gut is that he doesn't.
Yeah, I don't think so, and I don't think he does. But also, conservatives generally do not understand that either about reactionaries. So when you look at the things that Barry Weiss says about Donald Trump, so here is somebody who has made her entire career out of being professionally Zionist. Like she is also on aiding and abetting a fascist who appoints neo-Nazis, anti-Semites to his I mean, hell, his vice president is an anti-Semite, I would say. And like but she doesn't understand that this is what they want. And the same thing, you could just go down the line. All of these conservatives that align, like Joe Rogan, I don't see Joe Rogan as some sort of reactionary or something like that. He's just, a dopey conservative. Because
I've been challenged on this literally today, right?
Okay.
Because I just had the Prospect magazine article out, the reactionary centrist one, right? And the pushback I got, I actually kind of like. The pushback I got was that reactionary centrist is too charitable a term for them, and that actually these are people who are self-consciously trying to take us to fascism. Now, maybe that's true for like individual cases. You could go case by case. To take the trans issue in the UK, there are some people in the Labour government who genuinely are like, quite bigoted, I think. And then I think the main position is just cowardice, essentially. They're just saying what they think they need to say to get through the next news cycle. And then there are, to be fair, a few conscientious objectors who have raised concerns. But I think that it feels to me like the bulk view is just cowardice. It's not more profound than that. But I've had a lot of people in my mentions today saying that I'm giving them too much credit, that actually these are people who want us to move into an authoritarian, racist, whatever state. I don't know. I don't want to necessarily be in the position of defending them exactly. Like I say, I think it's dumber than people are imagining. These aren't masterminds with a long-term plan. They're cowards who are trying to get through the news cycle, but I could be wrong. I don't know. What's your view on that?
Well, you're making me think that maybe reactionary centrism is encompassing 3 viewpoints rather than 2, as I said earlier, so that it's encompassing conservatism, which generally is most of these people. It's encompassing pathological liberalism, which is this, kind of Rawlsian, Kantian, absurd, let's tolerate the intolerant kind of viewpoint. And then there is just the cowards and the ignoramuses who just are like, well, let's just do what people want.
I mean,
I think
to an
that's what
extent,
it
are
comes
those
down to.
mutually exclusive, though? Couldn't you have all three
No, not yet.
converging in one person?
I think you could. Yeah, I think you could. And the fact is, if you don't generally see people on the left who have truly economically progressive viewpoints, except for maybe some, deranged tankies or something. Further left people tend not to be upset about trans people existing and having rights. So like I think there is a considerable amount of overlap, and to what extent somebody has these views is I wouldn't say for particular people, but I think the thesis is 3.
Sorry, I know this is for an American audience. I've just been writing about British politics at the moment, so it's on my mind. But the UK case is quite instructive for the trans thing, because what's interesting with us is 3 or 4 years ago, no one cared. It's not like the States where we have like a long-standing, like sort of conservative, evangelical,
Christian, right,
religious I mean, it's there in the UK, but it's nowhere near the scale or the force, right? That's not a thing for us
Yeah.
as much. So as late as 2017 in the UK, in the 2017 election, every single one of the major parties, including the then governing Conservative Party under Theresa May, ran on making transition easier, changing the law so that essentially it's easier to change like your sex on your passport and your whatever, stuff like that, right? So like everyone had essentially, I would say, like a moderately pro-trans position, and it wasn't an issue that came up at all, right, in public discourse. And you had Labour MPs standing up and looking at what was happening in America and confidently declaring, this is a quote from a Labour MP called Cadbury, a bathroom ban will never happen in the UK. That they are now supporting without ever having done the Obama thing of I've thought about it and I changed my mind. They're just supporting it now.
Yeah.
Over the space of like a few years, it's swung that fast. And like what's going on in that person's head, I don't know. But like I don't know when I look at that that's some schemer who's had a long-term plan to walk us into fascism. That's not me giving them credit. We're talking about people who are willing, clearly, to do immense harm. But I don't know, it's I think it's dumbness. I think it's lack of any real deep values yourself. I think it's just cowardice. I don't know, but that's my read of it. I don't see, because people have been pushing me today, these are just closet fascists. Maybe in some cases, my view is actually the dumb, uncaring cowardice. It's a less satisfying story in some ways, but that probably is the story. I don't know. That's just what people have been asking me about.
Yeah. Well, I think that's, yeah, I think I'm inclined to agree with your viewpoint that, Hanlon's razor is undefeated. And from my
Yes.
standpoint, never attribute to malice what can be explained by incompetence. And that's why I would say that generally speaking, there basically is no such thing as a centrist. That centrists are people who are either, self-proclaimed centrists are either conservatives in denial, or they are people who have no coherent thoughts, and it's not really anything else. Because an actual centrist would, go after people on the left, and these people don't. So this is not what so they're not
I
any
yeah.
sort of centrist, is what I
I
would say.
think what I'm talking about is the latter, the person with no coherent thoughts, right?
Yeah.
They have biases. They're sort of like a conformist bias, right?
Yeah.
But they are unusually values free. Like I say, most people actually have fairly stable values. I'm not sure they do. But that's what I'm going after. So you can call it centrism, you can call it whatever. I'm not wedded to the label, but I have found it useful and it does seem to resonate with people. But yeah, that's what I've been talking about recently.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so maybe let's end, if you wouldn't mind. We've talked about the need for a affirmative values case. So how would, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you would like to make that affirmative values case, how would you say that it should be done?
US or UK context or just sort of general?
Oh, just general. Yeah.
Okay. We are living in an age of re-rising fascism. The same thing that we dealt with in the middle of the 20th century, it is back, and it is just as dangerous. This comes to you in all sorts of forms. It comes to you through YouTube, through the right-wing press, and here's what you really need to understand. These people are lying to you. They are lying to you about what is hurting your society. They are lying to you about what will let you have a good life. And we will all burn if you listen to them. A much better world is possible. I think we live in societies that are partially free, and I think that partial freedom is great, and I want to continue to expand it. I like living in a society that has different people who have different views and walks of life and religions and backgrounds to me. I think that's great. I think it's good for me. I like that as a man, I can choose my hobbies. My personal hobby is cooking, quite traditionally feminine. I like that I can do that in a liberal society. I don't like this conservative vision that there is only one thing to be a man and one thing to be a woman, and you have to be forced into that. I'd rather not live that life. And just by the by, the people who push that are dangerous and they're weird, and you shouldn't be listening to them or letting your children listen to them. I want people to have the best lives that they can. I want people to be as free as they can, as happy as they can, and do. We only have, 80 or 90 years on this planet to do as many interesting and fun and valuable things in their time as they possibly can in that time. Now, I'll agree, that is a vision very imperfectly realised. There's all sorts of things, be it economic inequality, be it inequalities of opportunity, be it many of the just faffs and stresses and annoyances of the world that get in the way of that. We have a lot of work to do, including political work, but let's do that. Let's not go back to top-down control on the basis of race or gender or anything like that. We have seen where that road goes. I don't know. You asked me to freestyle it, but something like that.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. So for people who want to keep up with your things, Toby, you have a podcast of your own as well. You want to talk about that a bit and tell them what other publications or social media you are using nowadays.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. So my podcast is called the Political Philosophy Podcast. It's exactly what it sounds like. Website for that is politicalphilosophypodcast.com. I interview a range of people on, issues similar to what we've been discussing, honestly. I sometimes do audio essays. I also write increasingly. I've only been doing that for like a few months, actually, but some of them seem to have had some traction and gotten a decent reception. I'm not on Twitter anymore. My main media is Blue Sky. You can search my name, Toby Buckle, or my handle is PolPhilPod, short for the podcast. But links, just my website is politicalphilosophypodcast.com. Links to all of my writing, podcast, ways to follow, social media, all there. So yeah, just Google Political Philosophy Podcast or politicalphilosophypodcast.com. And Thank you for having me on and an interesting discussion. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, me too. All right, so that'll do it for today. I appreciate you joining us for the conversation. And you can always get more if you go to theoryofchange.show, where we have the video, audio, and transcript of all the episodes. And if you are able to become a paid subscribing member of the show, then you have unlimited access to the archives. And I thank you very much for your support. And if you're watching on YouTube, make sure to click the like and subscribe button so you can get notified whenever we post a new episode. That would be great. Thanks a lot. I'll see you next time.